very excited to have Heather Zavodsky, Alan Coverstone, and Warren Simmons as our guest speakers today. I'll introduce them in the order of participation. Heather Zavodsky is the Director of Research at Educate Texas and the author of Building School Reform to Scale, 5 Exemplary Urban Districts, which analyzed 5 Broad Prize-winning districts. In her new book, School Turnarounds, The Essential Role of Districts, just out from Harvard Education Press, Heather has examined and drawn lessons from school turnaround in 5 urban districts across the country. Alan Coverstone is the Executive Director in the Office of Innovation in Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools. In his role as Executive Director of the School Innovation Zone, Alan is helping to build networks of effective practice and leadership across a set of low-performing schools. Warren Simmons is the Executive Director of the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University. He also serves as co-chair of the New York City Working Group on School Transformation, which has argued for alternatives to school closure, including a Success Innovation Zone to build instructional capacity in struggling schools. So now, without further ado, I will turn things over to Heather, and I will hand her the presenter button. Go ahead, Heather.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about what I believe is the important role of districts in turnaround, which was the topic of my last book. And thank you all for joining us today. So let me just try to give you a high-level information. There's a lot more details in the book. And I also want to clarify that when I talk about turnaround, I don't just refer strictly to the turnaround model defined by the Department of Ed or even the 4 turnaround models necessarily. To me, turnaround is kind of an interchangeable term with just the overall school improvement practice. So, you know, there's probably a lot of you on the line that are, you know, have looked at reform and are pretty reform weary. We've been looking at it for years and years and years, and there are folks that say, you know, nothing has changed in schools. And I think that comprehensive school reform movement was another telling one. But we've learned a lot through all these experiments, and I do see progress happening in schools. And so some of the lessons that we've learned over time in reform, the biggest is that piecemeal reform just isn't going to work. It doesn't rest in just one school, one program, one practice, or one silver bullet. So in other words, if you develop a really cool, nifty biotech program for high school students out of a large comprehensive school, if you still have students going into that program that read at the 4th grade level, they're still not going to get a lot out of the program. So rather, reform really needs to look at the whole K-12, or even better yet, the K-16 pipeline to really get students to where they need to go to the endpoints and beyond. And not only should it move across that entire continuum, but as an organization, it should move across the whole district system. So it should connect the central office to school administration and to classroom and then back. Reform should always be looking at what Richard Elmore refers to as the instructional core. That's really the heart of what needs to change and improve and what connects to student success. And the instructional core really moves beyond just what we traditionally think of as teaching and learning. Everything connects to that. Defining what to be taught and learned for sure, but also who's going to teach it, and how do you know, if you're reaching your goals, and who needs help, and how do you intervene? What should those interventions be? And then what's the context that's all happening with it, with the political relationships and the external and internal stakeholders. I mean, the other thing that we're really starting to see more, which came out in the evaluations of the comprehensive school reform movement, is that looking school by school isn't necessarily going to work. They didn't find any consistent positive results. But the schools that they did find results, there was a large role in the district's involvement in their reform. And so what I'll be talking to you about the remainder of the time is what the district can do in coordinating and aligning reform, especially drastic reform like known in the turnaround movement. So what exactly is district-led turnaround, and why do we care about the district level? Like, as I mentioned with the comprehensive school reform movement, it showed that there weren't lasting results. So there's some research behind it, but there's some real practical application there that we know about. In this slide, like I say, heroic principals and teachers, you know, we all have seen and read stories about Jaime Escalante and principals like Joe Clark in the movie Stand By Me that were able to really turn around a school. But those people don't stay at a school forever. And when you have a district and lots of different schools and neighborhoods, consistency across schools matter. You don't want the quality of a school that a student gets to have be determined by their zip code. Particularly in urban districts, kids move around in different schools. And so if you have an instructional program that is very different from one neighborhood to the other neighborhood, a student will experience a very fragmented instructional program, which is not what we want to have happen. And right now, especially in these resource-constrained times, it's very important to think about how can resources be best used and how can they really connect to district and school goals. So moving on, I really feel like the district is key for systemic change and in looking at the whole system. I put a favorite quote up there of mine of Tom Pezant. He said he always wanted to go into Boston and create a school system rather than a system of schools. To me, the district is the logical catalyst for this, kind of like the hub. The district is key for helping coordinate the whole reform or turnaround process, the communications, the resources, and supports. The district can also set the right kind of culture and climate for that work to create kind of collective accountability instead of it being, you know, that fourth grade teacher's kids or your kids or those counselors. That's all our kids. It's our system. The district is the one that can really provide a coherent educational program, and that a district can make sure that when you enter the system in kindergarten that you have a clear, coherent program all the way through to when you exit the program, and you're prepared for college and career readiness when you exit high school. It can also create consistency for mobile students, which I already touched on a little bit, and create system equity. The other thing I really try to point out in the book is why is it that I feel and have seen that districts, in particular central office, are crucial for the turnaround process. So I want to point out a few areas where districts always have a role in setting policy and practice that can either support or impede the turnaround or the improvement process. The main area is in personnel. Turnaround and school improvement is a human-intensive endeavor. It takes certain types of people to lead it, certain types of principals, certain types of teachers, and folks to coordinate and support it. And districts have a crucial role in, number one, attracting people into their system just by sheer reputation or how their hiring practices are. Boards hire superintendents, superintendents hire principals, principals hire teachers, teachers go into schools and follow certain types of principals. So districts are really key. Any kind of policy decision that's made at the district level will inevitably affect personnel. And so that's one crucial area that districts can assist in. The next area is in curriculum. It is up to a district to decide where they're going to take their state standards, how they're going to articulate it, how they're going to align them across the pipeline, communicate them, support them, will there be pacing guides, what type of professional development will be provided for the curriculum. And so there again, the district has a crucial role in helping coordinate curriculum, as well as instructional. A district can set a structured process for selecting and evaluating programs, or for deciding what high-quality instruction should look like, or is there a particular type of instructional strategy that they feel will yield to where they're trying to go with the level of rigor in the curriculum. Performance management is extremely important for the reform process, and a district is crucial for getting in the kind of system where you can create the ideal, one-stop shop where it's easy to pull any kind of data and put it together. It's easily accessible. People understand and are comfortable with using it. They know how to respond to it, and particularly the district can set the kind of culture where it's desired, it's transparent, and it's trusting. instead of beating folks over the head, it's used as, people will say, as a flashlight instead of a hammer. Districts also are very crucial in helping set up interventions for students, for teachers, for schools, and in matching the right interventions and knowing which ones to select and how to evaluate them. And last but certainly not least, districts can help with all the contextual factors that districts function in. We all know that improvement kind of lays in the balance of all the relationships and existing factors in districts. Resource allocation matters, school board superintendent relationships, unions and associations, parents and community and business. A district can kind of be the hub to bring all that together and keep everyone informed. So that kind of lays the background of how I frame the district's potential role in turnaround. And now I want to give you just a high-level view of what I found in 5 districts I've selected to talk about. I selected the 5 districts in the book because they were all employing some level of a district-driven turnaround process. They were all seeing some success. They all had different approaches. Some had school improvement grant funds and some didn't. I wanted to look at that. Some engaged external turnaround support partners and some did it themselves. So I was trying to really learn about all the different things that go into the turnaround process. So let me talk to you kind of high level first about Charlotte-Mecklenburg. The other thing I should mention too is that each district had kind of a really strong area that they did very well in. And for Charlotte-Mecklenburg, that would be their human capital strategies, very, very comprehensive. But the first thing that they began doing, that Charlotte began doing to improve their most struggling schools is, like a lot of other districts, they started with an achievement zone. So they identified their lowest struggling districts and made that into, excuse me, a zone, much like what Math Insight talks about. And they had one associate superintendent over the zone, and then those schools got immediate service, extra types of supports, and things like that. That approach yielded some real positive results. But Pete Gorman, at the time that was leading this work up until the beginning of last summer, still felt like that approach itself wouldn't guarantee a strong principal and teacher in every school in his district. So Pete worked with his school board and developed what is pretty well known now as the Strategic Staffing Initiative. And what that initiative set out to do was identify those lowest struggling schools and pair them with his strongest principals. And those principals would get an additional stipend. They brought over a specific team with them. Those principals got to identify specific teachers to bring over as well, and different leaders. And then they were able to identify a few teachers that they would let go out of their school. The other thing that they did that was very interesting that they still do is they had succession planning. And when I went to talk to them, I was thinking they were talking about, making sure they had a pipeline of principals and teachers. Their succession planning hits at all the district levels. So most interesting is that they even do it at the central office level. And they pair that with the next bullet that I have there. They use a forced ranking process. So at the central office level, if you have a curriculum director, they identify by a rubric the essential responsibilities of a high-functioning curriculum director. And then they rank order all their staff by how well they do all of those things. Those ranks are put in place to help develop the staff members and to identify who would be next in line to step into that position for that person to leave. And then there's the replenishing process. They did that at the central office level for key positions. They did that at the principal level and at the teacher level. So they knew who was strong and who needed what types of development. So that's a very high-level, quick overview of Charlotte-Mecklenburg, but the results were that they had positive growth in both math and reading in their 20 targeted schools, and that's data from almost 2 years back now. So moving on to the school district of Philadelphia, and when I was in there last summer, there was a lot going on. It's a very large district, and it was a very, very large turnaround effort. They were targeting 95 schools with a combination of district-led and charter-led models. They began, too, around 97, 98 with what, similar to the Achievement Zone, they called it the Empowerment Zone. Very similar properties, one person over it. They got a whole lot of extra types of support for the schools in immediate service. And they saw, they said something like 35% of the schools that hadn't made AYP in years and years and years made it after a year or two of those efforts. But some of them did not make any, didn't move the needle at all, and so they decided they needed a tiered approach. And so that's when they brought in the Promise Academies, which was an in-district approach, and then the Renaissance Schools, which was an external support where charter management organizations, or CMOs, would bid and take over a school. It would stay in the neighborhood, it would still serve the students, but the charter would take over the school. And the other thing I found is that they had really interesting, very strong parent engagement practices. Dr. Ackerman, who was there at the time, she was exiting just at the beginning of the summer, would have parent roundtables 6 times a year, and they had to start holding them in an auditorium because over 800 parents would come. And she would put parents in a Promise, if your child was going to go to a Promise Academy, those parents were put on a bus and driven to high-performing schools so that they could understand what kind of a program that they should advocate for their children. But the district was in great flux when I was there. There were a whole lot of political challenges going on, and the superintendent resigned. There was a buyout of her contract and a lot of fallout going on. But also, one of the things that happened to their work is that last summer they were in a huge court battle over with the teachers union. The teachers, they wanted to protect the Promise Academy teachers from force reduction by seniority. They had to cut a lot of teachers because of their budget. The court battle went on for a lot of the summer. Teachers were in flux. They didn't know whether they needed to look for a new school or not. And in the end, they lost the lawsuit. And so there were a lot of new teachers at the Promise Academies, and a lot of those, a lot of whole departments in certain schools were just decimated because they were laid off. But despite all those things that happened, they had a lot of positive results as well. They had, again, the needle moved in schools that hadn't for a long time. Student attendance improved, and they had a decrease in violent incidences. Now I'll move on to talking to you about Denver Public Schools. Denver is a place known for innovation. And Denver implemented 2 very interesting regional turnaround models, and they used innovative models for their turnaround models. One of the things that they did, so when Tom Boasberg took over the district, he really wanted to think about how could they improve instruction, how could they better connect to the community, and how could they improve their accountability system. And one of the things, they were starting to lose their school population. And so one of their approaches to changing that was to make some of their schools smaller so that they could increase personalization. But then you have a building that already wasn't full, and so they would fill the other part of that building with a very high-performing charter. So it would attract students back into the neighborhood and into the schools, but then you'd also have an interesting collaborative opportunity between the regular school or the program that stayed in there and then the charter. But they also felt like they needed a more nuanced system for understanding what their schools needed, if they needed any type of turnaround model, and what kind of supports they needed. So they developed the school performance framework, which is an amazing accountability process that they've set up. There are all kinds of data that goes into it, not only just proficiency data, but also growth data, student surveys, attendance, all kinds of information to really understand how well a school is performing and what types of supports do they need. And it was also color-coded, and everywhere you go around in Denver, everybody knows what color a school is, and so they understand what performance band they're in and if they're moving up. And it's a clear focus all over the district. They also used a very coherent plan. I almost put the visual that they put up there, but it wasn't very clear. But the important thing about them having a visual is that it really explains what the important components of the components are of their plan, and helps everybody understand how the arrows point in one direction. And everything always went back to the plan. Denver had some very positive results. Their targeted schools that they started with all moved up in accountability categories. Moving on to the next to the last district, Sacramento City Unified in California. Sacramento did not receive SIG funds, and so they wanted to target more schools, but they were only able to target 6 of what they called priority schools. These schools were also put together in something like a zone. They functioned like a professional learning community. The advantage that Jonathan Raymond, the superintendent, said of their inability to make it bigger is that it turned out that they had more ability to understand what worked to move the needle and what didn't work to move the needle. So it became a very nice pilot. When Jonathan came in, he felt like the district needed some reorganizing to really help focus on instruction and accountability and oversight. So he hired a chief instructional officer. He had 3 associate superintendents over the schools, and one particular one, the chief academic officer, was over the priority schools. And he also created a community engagement department. What he told principals to do, he selected strong principals for those priority schools, and he told them they were to design their dream school, so get an understanding of what was needed for that community, and they were given some autonomy to design their school. He also worked with an external partner that helped him with a data inquiry process. They actually, it was somewhat like DataWise. What they did is combine that so that they used DataWise to really look at schools and understand performance, but then they had teams drill down and really look at student assignments. This was the first time I had seen a district get this deep into analyzing instruction and really understanding, how were they assigning work, what would the best student product look like, how do you make sure you explain it to students and get them there. And they gave me notebooks to look at where you could see student work at the beginning of the year and then the end of the year, and the quality really you could see changed. And they did a number of other things, but that was the main interesting thing that they did. They also had games in almost all of their schools and their composite English language arts games. And then the final school I had in the book was Long Beach. And when I called Chris Steinhauser and said, I'm doing this book on turnaround, I'm looking at districts that have received SIG funds, and Chris informed me that they didn't have any schools in improvement status. And I thought, well, that makes them a real important case for prevention. And I think partly why they haven't had any schools in improvement for a while is Long Beach is a well-known, high-functioning organization. They're just very coherent district, probably partly bolstered by the fact they've had 2 superintendents in 20 years, which is in these times unheard of. Their approach was they still had schools that weren't up to where they wanted to be, and so they had identified 8 of their schools. These were actually K-8 schools, but they were focusing on the middle school area, and they were also put together in professional learning communities and given new math and English language arts programs, and then lots of supports. But the other thing they did was take all of the 6th graders in that group of schools and put them in a 6th grade academy, 2,000 of them. And from the way Chris described it, there were no bells. They had flexibility all day long. So, students could stay with teachers all day. If you had the students, the struggling readers were put with the strongest reading teachers. If a student needed to work with a teacher particularly good in a certain area, they were able to do that. So they were given full flexibility. And they had really good results from that. And their results showed that they moved up so much in one year that they were almost up to where the district average was, and they were really far below before. So that's a very fast overview of the 5 districts, just to give you an idea of the approaches that the districts took in supporting their entire improvement process. But they weren't without challenges, and these challenges are kind of confirmed by a lot of work that other folks are doing in turnaround in the field and in research. One of the biggest problems, as I had said, turnaround is a very human-intensive process. And some of these districts, not Charlotte, but the other districts were under union contracts. And a lot of times the union contracts really impeded their ability to allocate people and time as they wanted to. As I mentioned, in Philadelphia, they ended up decimating entire staffs in schools because new teachers were laid off. Even when they offered a stipend, the experienced teachers didn't choose to go into those schools. So they had all new teachers and lost a lot of them. In Sacramento, they were able to head that off. They also had to fight it in court, but they were able to get their union folks to agree that if they could show that staff members were hired specifically for their skills for that school and that their training was done separately, so they had to have it at a separate time, they had to show a separate agenda, but if they could show that it was unique to that teacher, then those teachers were protected from seniority-based layoffs. Recruiting leaders and teachers to struggling schools is difficult. Folks don't always choose to go to those places, and so the districts employed different things to do there. They had to offer stipends. Charlotte-Mecklenburg really touted it as an honor to be selected for those schools. And then teachers also said that they sometimes just followed principles that they felt like were strong. There's often community opposition to turnaround models, especially closures and charter restarts. From what folks say is people identify with their schools, and they feel like outsiders are taking it over when it's a charter. But like one of the principals told me in Philadelphia, one thing that frustrates him is that you can reach out to the community year after year after year when a school is struggling and say, you know, we need you here, and they're not there. And then when you mention closing a school, they're there in droves. Denver and Charlotte-Mecklenburg invested a lot of time to market those schools and meet with the communities. Lack of resources was, I'm going to move it along pretty quickly. I know my time is almost up. Lack of resources was also an issue. Sacramento didn't have the SIG funds. And Charlotte was also struggling to figure out how would they continue to give their teachers stipends. The book highlights a number of lessons in different areas in turnaround, and I'll just touch on a few in managing turnaround. But all of the districts employed some manner of a cohort organizational structure, which worked really well. A feeder pattern structure works even better for continuity for students. Before selecting a model, you have to really think about the political context of where you are. If you're in a place that is really against charters, that may be a difficult model to implement. You know, involve the right stakeholders at the table, provide ample support for principals. The lone wolf strategy, one of the district folks told me, doesn't work so well. It works a lot better when people are able to come over with a team. There were a number of these districts that engaged partners. Nobody's an expert at everything. So, you know, some of them would use Cambridge to do external reviews and understand how well they were going. And that was a very successful thing. The districts that worked with their charters, it's an important thing to work closely with them so that you can learn from each other and still have an idea of what's going on with the students in the community. Piloting worked well. Sacramento can attest to that. Another thing that several of them said was that, you know, it's hard, but a clean start really was easier to implement than changing an embedded culture. The other thing they said is that one should always be prepared for mid-course corrections, because no matter how well you plan, you're going to end up with changes. And I'll just conclude by reiterating that all the districts, they employed different approaches. You know, there's no right answer, there's no right model. You know, having a partner worked for some, not having a partner worked for others. What seemed to work the most is having a clear, coherent plan, getting the right people at the table, having a commitment, and staying the course. That works better in well-functioning and aligned systems than individual schools from what I've seen. And that alignment, in my opinion, is best driven from a centralized source, like a school district. And I'll just stop and conclude there and turn it back over to Jacob. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Heather. And I really think it just shows so many of the quite diverse approaches taken by different districts, and that they all raise student achievement through these district-led strategies, but all in different and innovative ways. So now I'd like to turn it over to our next speaker, and I should mention if there's Heather's book out from Harvard Education Press. Our next presenter or respondent is Alan Coverstone, the Executive Director, the Office of Innovation at Metro Nashville Public Schools, who has an on-the-ground perspective that we're really excited to hear him share today. Alan?
Thanks, Jacob. I hope everyone can hear me well. I'm really honored and humbled to be part of this conversation. I think that was a great overview from Heather, and I appreciate your sharing it. It is important, I think, to learn from each other, and almost all of what we've tried to do and are trying to do and talk about mid-course corrections, we're always in the midst of those, but what we're trying to do is borrowed heavily from lessons of all the places that Heather mentioned. Those are exactly the places where we've drawn a lot of the ideas that we're hoping to put together in a way that addresses Nashville's situation specifically and most effectively. As I've worked with a new cluster of innovation zone principals this year, focusing on leadership in turnaround settings, and trying to come to grips with the realities of the challenges associated with turnaround and the realities of the track records of efforts at turnarounds and the likelihood or unlikelihood of success for people in those positions. I've tried to stress over and over again that we need to stay focused on the question, what makes us different? Far from being just smarter or more caring or harder working than people who've done it before, our principals are just in the same kinds of categories as other people who have tried. And if we focus on what makes us different or what makes it possible for us to be different in this circumstance, I think that helps us to prioritize as we embark on the turbulent waters of actually addressing and delivering on turnaround in school environments. And so I hope that I'll be able to focus in just a few minutes on some of the things that we're focused on and a bit of the context about Nashville, and then I'll turn it back over, knowing that I'll leave a lot unsaid. Our view, I think, is that the capacity to educate all students at the highest levels is still in development, and that while as an ideal we accept it, we have not ever, particularly in Nashville, delivered the resource capacity to accomplish it at the high level that we'd like. And that means resources in terms of human resources, from leadership capacity and effective teachers to financial resources, and in particular in the pro-reform environment that we find ourselves in, especially in Nashville at the heart of the race to the top world. What we have is thousands of different funding sources that are cobbled together with different priorities and different reform strategies at their core that have to be put into some kind of a coherent package and coherent vision if we're going to be successful in leveraging those resources, and that's where the resources have to come from. And then in terms of capacity, in terms of time, the time that we have to spend, the time that kids have spending in our classes to be successful, all of those capacities have to be expanded. And in Nashville, we had and have a fairly subdivided effort. If you think about our citywide efforts, we have a strong private school sector, we have charter schools that are new and growing, we have magnet schools, enhanced option schools, zone schools, and a variety of other types of schools that from time to time have been part of reform efforts and packages that have been on the horizon. So the question for us is, how do we capitalize on the lessons from those different schools and use those to eliminate and change the trajectory and outcomes for our lowest performing schools and for the students who are in those schools, so that we can truly realize the vision of educating everyone to the highest levels. And we think that divisions like this, if allowed to just result in a decentralized survival of the fittest competitive environment, can produce multiple parallel systems, but those systems will probably all be good at the same things and bad at the same things. And so if we're talking about a role for the district, and if that's the centerpiece of this discussion, I would say that the role of the district in Nashville is to manage that competition, to manage those different sectors, so that we can maximize our capacity and distribute the resources effectively to achieve our goal of educating all students to the highest level. And that means taking on the turnaround challenge very directly, but it also means taking on the turnaround challenge with a variety of different tools and resources that we can bring to bear. I think at the center of that is our ability as a district to engage in performance management. And thinking about the lessons drawn from the Denver experience are lessons that we find very important here. How do we articulate what it is that we expect and want from our schools in a way that's consistent across different types of schools, different types of leadership, different types of organization, and different types of intervention strategies? We need a common performance framework in order to address that, and ultimately in order to assess the needs assessments that we do in engaging in turnaround, as well as the strategic investments that we make, probably not just in terms of turnaround, but certainly focused on that in this capacity. I would say that at its core, our strategy places a heavy emphasis on developing networks to unleash the trapped capacity that's out there in the system, and by the system I mean, of course, the district system, but also the citywide educational system as a whole, which has other components in it too. In order to unleash capacity, we need to first know where it is, which means a very focused sense of our data management and our data analysis so that we know what schools good practices are in, what classes, what halls, what groups of schools, et cetera, we can find great practices in. We need to be able to analyze our data to know where people are beating expectations, where traditionally marginalized groups are doing well, and where high-achieving students are being stretched, among a whole host of other challenges that we want to gather resources and information on. It's that information that's the basis then for connecting principals, teachers, and other leaders to one another so that an excellent practice or capacity-enhancing tool that exists in one school can actually be spread to other schools in an effective and efficient way, and done so according to the needs that that school also feels that are being measured in similar ways. The second thing then is to encourage the connections. And to encourage the connections, we are interested in developing leadership capacity because the leadership capacity to distribute that responsibility through a school will encourage those connections. But it ultimately means balancing a genuine accountability system with the autonomy to achieve the goals in that accountability system through flexible interventions at the school level. You know, at the end of the day, I guess if we're focused on one thing, we're focused on the kind of leadership that can give us a balanced approach to decision-making, knowing what the right decisions are to make at the school level versus the right decisions to make at the center is not an ultimate answer that we will discover, and Heather pointed that out, but rather it is something that we need input both from principals and from central office leadership on in order to develop and understand where that balance is for each school so that we capitalize on the benefits of centralized accountability, centralized oversight, centralized resource maximization, but at the same time capitalize on the instructional excellence that comes when student voice is experienced, when teachers know who their students are, when the students' relationships with teachers are understood in a deeply personal way that will facilitate and allow greater differentiation and greater engagement of all the students in the school. So just briefly, looking at our innovation cluster, we have, well, our office has both startup charter schools, conversion charter schools, magnet schools, and these innovation schools. And I just want to focus on the innovation schools for the moment. That is 10 schools whose principals are brought together in a professional cohort and whose focus is leadership in a turnaround setting. And we lean to components and categories of leadership that will help these principals to articulate clear and compelling visions that will enlist the leadership capabilities of everyone within their school. We combine that leadership focus with aggressive achievement targets and a staffing design which emphasizes that I-teachers, as we call them, who are teachers who will teach in our Innovation Zone schools, are teachers who both meet effectiveness criteria using our Tennessee value-added system data and our Tennessee team evaluation process, that these are effective teachers, but they're also teachers who are proficient in the capacities that are associated with turnaround success, like those that Public Impact has written on, driving for results, influencing results, problem solving, and showing the confidence to lead, and the subcategories in those. Finally, we're developing on school-level team building, focusing on school-level team building as well, and we're working with a group known as Tribal using a navigator self-assessment process combined with an external review team that takes a look at the self-assessment work that the school does at the school level, combines that with an external review and a hard data analysis in order to inform intelligent planning, but school-based planning that empowers the teachers in the ownership of their own improvement journey. At the end, we're trying to accomplish total ownership of the turnaround process, and that means that the teachers, the leaders, the students, and the community all have to be involved. And the role for the central office there is not only to make sure that we hold the schools accountable for those outcomes, but that we are able to provide the resources to identify the best practices and to facilitate the network connections that will make it possible for excellent teachers in one school to have a reach beyond their own classroom and into other parts of their own school as well as other parts of the district in the interest of unleashing that effective capacity that we're trying to build. You know, I think that innovation comes from good ideas, and I read somewhere recently, if you want to have good ideas, you have to have a lot of ideas. And so our goal is to enlist as many individual people in this process and the ownership of this process as possible by focusing on those leadership levers.
Thanks, Alan. I always feel terrible asking someone like Alan to limit his comments in such a short period of time. There's a lot of really dynamic reform going on in Nashville, both through the turnaround work as well as district-wide. So I encourage people to look at that Nashville story and to contact Alan to learn more about that. And I also encourage people to, again, if you have questions, please use the chat function and send that to me privately, Jacob Mishuk. And now I will turn things over to the Executive Director of the Annenberg Institute, Warren Simmons, for his comments.
Can you hear me, Jacob?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I want to make my comments based on a set of experiences I have. One of the most recent experiences I have is co-chairing the Working Group on School Transformation in New York City. But two other relevant experiences I have that inform my observations here and responses to the two previous presentations is that I co-chair the Aspen Urban Superintendents Network with my colleague Bob Schwartz. And that network has superintendents from 16 of the largest urban districts in the country, and I'm also a regular participant in the California Collaborative. I think what we haven't unpacked in this conversation thus far is that I think there's considerable agreement about the what, but the how varies based on the theory of action that districts are adopting. And there are several districts, particularly those in large urban communities in Chicago, and New Orleans, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Detroit, and LA, that are adopting a portfolio strategy, where in fact that strategy entails having a central office that reduces its role in instructional capacity building and emphasizes performance management, allocating most of the fiscal resources to schools and giving schools incredible amounts of autonomy, and using primarily school choice and school closures as levers for improvement. So one of the things that the Transformation Working Group in New York noted was that in a district that has been embarking increasingly on the portfolio strategy in New York, who exactly is responsible for providing the supports that Heather articulated in her presentation? It turns out it's not the central office because it's not their theory of action. The responsibility for school improvement is primarily placed on the shoulder of principals and teachers who are supported in New York by what they call partner support organizations, which could include charter management organizations or education management organizations, E&Os. The problem with that strategy is that the central office then is reduced to recruiting high quality and competent teachers, ensuring that fiscal resources are maximized at the school level, and essentially monitoring school performance and closing schools that don't meet standards. Instructional capacity building in the way that Heather described it is something the district no longer does, and that's what Philadelphia is embarking on, what Detroit is embarking on with New Orleans. So the problem then becomes, how do schools that are failing, which historically and through research have a common set of challenges produce the kind of capacity to address challenges which really go beyond the schools. Most of the schools that are failing in New York and other cities have high concentrations of English language learners, high concentrations of students with disabilities, high concentrations of students from impoverished communities, high concentrations of students who are in the foster care system, who have been recently adjudicated, involved in the juvenile justice system. These are common shared problems, and to pretend that each individual school and staff and principals should invent their own solution to longstanding problems, we believe, or several members of the School Transformation Work Group believe, is short-sighted, that the district does retain the responsibility for instructional capacity building. I think we argue in New York that in light of a portfolio strategy, perhaps it's not the responsibility of a traditional central office to build the supports that strengthen the instructional core, but certainly the district is responsible for assembling a collaborative partnership that could include school-based staff, district staff, and reform partner organizations and research institutions to gather best practices, assess them in relationship to the context of schools and communities in New York City, and provide supports to cohorts of schools that not only consist of failing schools, because the other problem with creating networks of failing schools is that you essentially have struggling schools trying to support other struggling schools. What we argued in New York City was that the district should constitute a success initiative, which in fact would have high-performing elementary, middle, and high schools that would serve as professional development laboratories for failing schools, and some kind of collaborative instructional capacity building organization that could include local universities and colleges, local reform partners, as well as national advisors, identifying best practices and tailoring them to meet the needs of individual schools in New York. This is a challenge that many communities are facing now that the portfolio strategy has been in place for over 6 or 7 years in many places, New Orleans being one of the most mature portfolio strategies, that despite the fact that the portfolio strategy was motivated in response to dysfunctional central offices that in fact historically haven't done good work in improving schools, that does not negate the fact that one needs a systemic approach, as Heather articulated. And yet I guess the question the School Transformation Work Group is struggling with, and I think many of the portfolio systems that have been in place now for 3 years and beyond are faced with, is how do you create a system that doesn't reinvent the old central office and its standardization and its lack of responsiveness and its control, but nonetheless supports, in addition to performance management, instructional capacity building and innovation. We argued in New York, and the people on this work group was co-chaired by myself and Zakia Ansari from the Alliance for Quality Education and the Coalition for Educational Justice, but included people like John Jackson and President of the Schott Foundation, Pedro Noguera from NYU, John Snyder, Dean of Bank Street College, Carmen Farina, a former regional superintendent and deputy chancellor in New York, obviously members of the teachers unions and school principals. What we attempted to do is try to blend some of the lessons that Heather articulated about core functions into a portfolio system, and argue that the cohort should be a mixed cohort in terms of performance, not one that's homogeneously low performing, that there should be research-based practices, but one of the things we learned from the comprehensive school reform movement is taking a model that works in Los Angeles and adopting it in New York doesn't make the most sense. It requires that the model be adapted and modified to deal with the unique circumstances in New York City and unique forms of human capital and cultural capital and social histories in New York City as well. And so several communities are hard at work in trying to help the portfolio systems evolve and get beyond school closure and choice as major levers of improvement and reconstitute the function of instructional capacity building, but not in the traditional central office control and led way, but one that creates broader partnerships with local and national organizations, and recognizes that there are some common challenges beyond the competence of human capital that most districts face, that we have to begin to talk about, that many of these schools have high concentrations of students with disabilities, English language learners, students who are overage for their grade level, which means there are enormous achievement gaps that they're facing, and a host of other problems that are academic in nature, but also involve health concerns, social concerns, and safety concerns that have to be part of the mix of things that are not only being managed, but also addressed in the way of building instructional capacity and providing extended learning opportunities and supports. I think that, in a nutshell, is the position that the work group articulated and that several districts and communities are now engaged in. I've had conversations recently in Philadelphia about this challenge with colleagues in the district and communities in Chicago, and certainly this is a conversation that New Orleans is having, how to rebuild central system functions without recreating the inertia of the old central office, but doing it in a way that builds instructional capacity and gets beyond school closure and damning teachers as failures as the primary levers for school transformation and improvement.
Thank you, Warren. I think I would speak for all the participants in the webinar saying that this has been just seeing just such a wide range of examples of especially large urban districts doing this kind of turnaround work. I think it was an honest discussion about a lot of the challenges that districts face. We do have some questions that came in. One was a question for Heather, but I think it really is good for all of our panelists, and especially around developing instructional capacity. So, and it's about the role of teachers. A lot of the examples that Heather, that you provided, this participant said they looked very top down. They looked very top down to her. There wasn't as much mention about working with teachers as professionals and partners. And so was there an aspect of your study that looked at working with teachers as professionals, how you measure how teachers felt about this work? And I think this is, but I think this is broadly applicable to all our panelists. But I'll start with Heather.
Yeah, so it probably sounds top down because what I'm trying to show is the approach from the district's purview of what they did, but the district serves kind of as the catalyst to coordinate all this. The reason why it works is because the district was bringing the right people at the table at the right time, and in almost every instance, that main group would be teachers, and so the districts would put together mechanisms where teachers can give feedback. Teachers were involved in every aspect of it. So if it's figuring out the design of the model, teachers were involved. Teachers were involved in informing the curriculum alignment process, and in figuring out what types of instruction will really engage kids. And I interviewed and talked to a number of teachers, and how they felt about the school. I got to talk to teachers that came to new schools, teachers that stayed in their school, and could say, how it felt to have it change, and was it a good thing. And so they were very involved too. I just mostly was focusing on the district's perspective.
If I was going to, I would chime in here, and I'd say that's one of the that problem of the central office control change as opposed to school and teacher-led is at the heart of why people have moved to the portfolio strategy, which reduces the central office's role in instructional capacity building. I think in the new portfolio strategy, in its ideal form, the central office role shifts from controlling instructional improvement to coordinating and facilitating it using evidence and using a range of partners, including teachers and principals organized into networks of professional learning communities, but also reform support organizations and research institutes as well. So building that new partnership is a task that I know our colleagues in Nashville are confronting, and Philadelphia, and New York City is attempting to articulate, as well as Chicago. But it does require a shift in the role of central office from command and control and top-down direction to one of research and evidence-based coordination and facilitation, and also coordination and facilitation that is informed by the new standards, and it's also accountable as well.
Thanks. Thanks for those. We have another question, and that's moving up to more the state and federal level. And one question to all the panelists is thoughts on state and federal policies that support the development of districts in building this capacity for turnaround, and what policies are barriers to the development of this capacity. And if you have any examples of that. I mean, I know, Alan, not to put you on the spot, but Tennessee is obviously a district that's a race to the top winner. There's lots of major policies coming out of there. You don't have to chime in first, but I put that question to you and for the rest of the presenters.
Yeah, well, I think there's, it's the same relationship that we're talking about in trying to find the right decision-making balance between the central office and the schools that happens with the state and the districts. And so in Tennessee, we really benefit from the fact that the AYP waiver application included the concept of the innovation zones as a way for us to contribute to the kind of dramatic turnaround goals that the priority schools designation has brought, and to do that by really adding capacity that the state wouldn't have to directly manage those schools themselves, and which probably wouldn't be the best approach necessarily anyway. It's just important that that relationship be a relationship, and that it be a collaborative relationship where we can interact with one another and discuss where those lines are, because I think the danger is when you start drawing lines of responsibility firmly for one side or the other in the state versus the district, it becomes an antagonistic relationship, and we lose sight of the fact that we're trying to capitalize on the strengths that each of the different groups have in order to achieve the goals we have for the kids.
My own view is that Race to the Top has inadvertently created a role imbalance at federal, state, and local levels. Because of the budget crises and many of these districts and states have faced, the Race to the Top dollars, those billions of dollars, have led to an overemphasis at the federal, state, and local levels on performance management, data, and compensation and evaluation, and hasn't left enough resources available to focus on instructional capacity building, no matter whose role and responsibility it is. I think there's a recognition of that in the U.S. Department of Education, and I think in their work going forward, and some of the conversations and PowerPoints that I've seen them develop, they have appreciated that they do have to devote more resources into instructional capacity building, although they have to be careful about that because of restrictions in the traditional federal role, but providing resources to states and districts so they do get at developing curriculum and pedagogical tools that address the unique needs of the groups that are identified earlier: students with disabilities, English language learners, students over age for their grade. But certainly in the last 3 years of Race to the Top, what we've seen is a mirroring of roles, with the federal government emphasizing performance management choice, states using those resources under the direction of the government to emphasize human capital management and choice, and districts following suit, which leaves the responsibility for schools to use their limited resources to address these major instructional needs. Now, that might be an exaggeration, but when I have conversations with principals and teachers in New York and other places, they talk about their limited opportunities to collaborate within and across schools, and the limited opportunities and resources to develop new approaches and effective approaches to long-standing problems that evidence said exist across schools, but the reform strategy is almost targeted specifically to school by school, as opposed to a networking community approach that Heather implied would be more effective.
So I'll just hop in and say one of the things I wanted to look at in writing the book is the impact of the school improvement grant, good and bad. And what most folks said is they appreciated that amount of money showed a seriousness and commitment that we had to do something about all these struggling schools. And a lot of them felt like it gave them money to dig in and try some things and see if they will work, with the understanding that they will probably keep doing the things that will work, and they know that that money will be gone, and they'll have to figure out how to get their own skin in the game. So there's that. And I think what always happens is this struggle between trying to add some structure to the process, because if everybody knew how to do it by themselves, we wouldn't be having this conversation. They'd just be doing it. So trying to balance giving some structure and using what we know, and yet giving autonomy to do what we need to do, and balance, you know, this is a lot of dollars, and so it's important. There has to be a lot of bureaucratic structures in place, and so that's a big tension, you know, to try to work. And so some of the things I've seen is the state departments that kind of resisted the bureaucratic part and didn't just approach it like compliance, but tried to really support the districts really worked. And then there's other things that kind of work at odds with each other. So, you know, in SIG, in some of the models, in the transformation model, one of the things that they wanted them to do is to look at teacher evaluation. But in some states, it's already set, and you can't do anything with that. And then, you know, some of the things you can't do because of union contracts. So there's all that, you know, those nuances in the mix.
Great. Thank you. We're going to have to end it there because we are already a couple of minutes over our time, and I'm sure this conversation could keep going all day, and I urge you to contact any of the panelists with your questions or comments. But we're at the end of our time now. So thank you to Heather, to Alan, and Warren for leading us in this thoughtful discussion on the role of districts in school turnaround, and to all the participants for being so engaged. We'll be posting the recording of this webinar, the PowerPoint on the website, as well as other resources, including an Annenberg Institute commentary that will also deal with similar issues of turnaround. So thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon.